Important notice. This content uses synthetic narration generated by artificial intelligence. All references to Richard Feynman are grounded in verifiable public records, including lectures, published works, and interviews, faithfully reflecting his original thinking, without fictional additions or sensationalized interpretations. This channel is an independent educational project and has no institutional affiliation with Richard Feynman, his heirs, or the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. The sole purpose of this material is educational, to promote critical thinking, conceptual clarity, and intellectual honesty through the scientific method advocated by Feynman.
Have you ever felt intimidated while reading a philosophy text? That feeling that no matter how hard you try, the words seem to float on a different plane of existence, connected by a logic that eludes you. It's a common experience, almost a rite of passage in the intellectual world. We are confronted with dense paragraphs, full of jargon like hermeneutics, epistemology, or the categorical imperative, and the initial reaction is almost always the same: guilt. We assume the fault lies within us, that our minds are not trained or sophisticated enough to climb those conceptual heights. This feeling of inadequacy is a powerful weapon, silencing questioning before it even arises. We accept complexity as a synonym for depth, and obscurity as a sign of genius. We become accustomed to nodding our heads in passive agreement, feigning an understanding we don't possess, so as not to appear ignorant. But what if this entire premise is wrong? What if the fault lies not with the listener, but with the speaker? What if the true mark of intelligence is not the ability to complicate, but the courage to simplify to the bone? This passive acceptance of complexity is poison to genuine thought. And there is one figure in the history of science who dedicated his life to providing the antidote: Richard Feynman. For him, if an idea couldn't be explained in simple terms, it probably wasn't well understood by the person expressing it. The promise of this channel, The Myth Destroyer, is to arm you with Feynman's mental arsenal. Today, we'll delve into a story, almost a legend, about the day he entered territory that seemed the opposite of his world of physics, a philosophy seminar, and, with a single question, exposed the fragility of an intellectual house of cards. We won't just tell an anecdote. We'll dissect the mental tool he used, a sharp blade capable of cutting through the fog of jargon and pretension. By the end of this video, you will not only understand the power of this tool, but you will know exactly how to use it in your own life to challenge empty authority and demand clarity, transforming yourself from a passive spectator into an active participant in the pursuit of truth. To understand the weapon Feynman would use against obscure philosophy, we need to go back to his childhood, to a fundamental lesson that shaped his entire worldview. His father, Melville Feynman, instilled in him a crucial distinction, one that would become the basis of his skepticism and his brilliance. The story Feynman often told was about birds. While other children learned the names of birds, Feynman's father showed him something much deeper. He would say, "See that bird? It's a brown-throated thrush, but in Germany they call it Halsenvogel, and in China Chungling, and so on. But even if you know all the names people give it, you still know absolutely nothing about the bird." What mattered was not the label, but the observation, what the bird does, why it pecks its feathers, how it flies. This simple lesson was, in fact, a philosophical bomb. She taught that knowing the name of something is not the same as understanding it. It was the first and most powerful demonstration that language can be a mask for ignorance, a collection of empty labels that gives us the illusion of knowledge. This principle, the difference between the name and the thing, became the cornerstone of Feynman's entire approach. While many of his fellow scientists and academics delved into increasingly esoteric equations and terminology, Feynman maintained an almost childlike obsession with fundamental understanding. For him, science was not a vocabulary to be memorized, but a method for not being deceived. He developed a healthy disdain for any form of authority that relied on grandiose words rather than testable evidence. This philosophy put him on an inevitable collision course with certain areas of human knowledge that, by their very nature, rely heavily on language and interpretation rather than empirical verification. He saw social scientists, educators, and especially some philosophers engaging in a dangerous game, creating complex systems of jargon that referred only to other jargon, building theoretical structures that floated in the air without any point of contact with concrete reality. This practice was, for him, the absolute antithesis of the pursuit of truth. It was a sophisticated form of collective self-deception. The confrontation with philosophy was not an isolated event, but the natural consequence of this philosophy of life. For Feynman, the intellectual enemy was not a specific discipline, but a way of thinking, loose thinking, the acceptance of ideas without rigorous examination. Philosophy, especially those branches that stray from logic and practical ethics to delve into abstract metaphysics, became the perfect battleground for this war. This is because, in this terrain, words are everything. Concepts like being, nothing, or the essence of becoming can be debated for centuries without reaching a verifiable conclusion. For Feynman, this was a red flag. He believed that the purpose of thought was not to generate endless debates, but to solve problems and understand the world more clearly. The antithesis of his philosophy was, therefore, any system that generated complexity for its own sake, that valued obscurity, and that protected its ideas behind an impenetrable wall of language. He saw this not only as a waste of time, but as a real danger, an intellectual disease that hindered progress and fostered a false sense of wisdom. The intellectual weapon Feynman would use in this confrontation was forged not in a physics laboratory, but in the frustration of his experiences as a teacher and observer of human knowledge. During his time in Brazil, he was shocked to discover that students could memorize and recite entire pages of physics, but could not apply the concepts to a simple real-world situation. They knew the names of phenomena, but didn't understand birds. This experience solidified his conviction that the traditional teaching method was failing to create genuine thinkers. It was this frustration that led him to refine and formalize a technique for testing true understanding, both his own and that of others. He needed a tool, a procedure, to cut through the fat of memorization and get to the heart of understanding. The idea was simple, but brutally effective. If you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it. This was not just a maxim, but the operating principle of a method he would relentlessly apply to himself and anyone who dared to make a claim of knowledge in his presence. This intellectual weapon became known as the Feynman Technique. Its mechanics are disarmingly simple, divided into 4 clear steps. First, choose a concept you want to understand and write it at the top of a sheet of paper. Second, and this is the crucial step, pretend you are teaching this concept to a child. Use only simple language, concrete analogies, and avoid any jargon. This act of translation forces you to confront what you actually know. Third, whenever you get stuck, whenever you need to resort to complex terminology or realize your explanation is confusing, you have identified a gap in your own understanding. Go back to the source material, books, articles, lectures, and fill that gap until you can explain the point simply. Fourth, revise and simplify your explanation even further, reading it aloud to ensure it flows clearly and logically. The end result is not just a note, but a deep and lasting understanding. This technique is a universal nonsense detector. She transforms learning from a passive act of absorption into an active act of construction and deconstruction, ensuring that knowledge is real and not just a collection of empty words. Now, let's paint the scene of the conflict. Imagine a classic academic setting, a philosophy seminar room at a respected university. The air is heavy with an almost religious seriousness. The bookshelves are filled with works by Kant, Hegel, and Heidegger. The audience consists of graduate students and professors, all dressed in the intellectual uniform of the time, with expressions that oscillate between deep concentration and studied reverence. The lighting is soft, the acoustics designed to give weight to every word spoken. In this environment, clarity is often viewed with suspicion as a sign of superficiality, while complexity is applauded as a marker of depth. It is a place where ideas are not merely discussed, but performed. The atmosphere is not one of collaborative discovery, but of intellectual display, where every question and every comment is measured by its potential to demonstrate one's own erudition. It is into this sanctuary of abstraction that Richard Feynman enters, a physicist, an outsider, someone who operates with an entirely different set of rules, an intellectual predator in an ecosystem of complacent prey. In the center of the room, a visiting philosopher is at the height of his presentation. He speaks with a hypnotic cadence, weaving a web of terminology that leaves the audience fascinated and perplexed. Words like deontic structure, transcendental subjectivity, and the phenomenology of the other are uttered with unquestionable authority. The reasoning is circular. He defines an obscure term using other, equally obscure terms, creating a closed system that is impossible to penetrate or refute. He cites other philosophers not to clarify a point, but to position himself within a lineage of thought, using names as shields. The examples, when they appear, are as abstract as the theory they are supposed to illustrate. The audience is caught in a cycle of admiration and confusion, many of them frantically taking notes, not because they understand, but because they hope to understand later, in some magical moment of revelation. They are witnessing what Feynman most despised: language not as a tool for communication, but as a barrier to understanding, a social ritual designed to separate the initiates from the laymen. While the room drowns in jargon, Feynman's perspective is radically different. He is neither impressed nor irritated. He is curious, like a naturalist observing an animal with peculiar behavior. He listens with predatory patience, ignoring the music of words and searching for the substance, the connection to reality. He doesn't try to follow the flow of the argument's internal logic. Instead, he asks himself a single question, repeatedly. What does this mean, in concrete terms? Where can I see this happening in the real world? He observes the nods in the audience and sees not understanding, but the social contagion of intellectual conformity. He analyzes the speaker and sees not a seeker of truth, but a magician who distracts the audience with one hand while doing nothing with the other. And then, in a moment of clarity, he identifies the fundamental flaw, the weak point in the entire armor of the discourse. The whole structure, the entire impressive castle of concepts, is floating in the air, built on a sandy foundation of undefined terms and untestable abstractions. The presentation ends. The room echoes with polite applause, a sound more of an acknowledgement of effort than a celebration of clarity. The speaker, satisfied, opens the floor for questions. Hands go up, and the first questions are, in themselves, exercises in exhibitionism, attempts to connect the lecture with some other obscure theorist, to show that the questioner is also part of the club. The atmosphere is one of self-satisfaction, and then a different hand rises. It is not the hesitant hand of a student, nor the anxious hand of a colleague wanting to shine. It is the calm and firm hand of Richard Feynman. The room, noticing the presence of the famous physicist, falls silent. The tension shifts. The intellectual game is about to be interrupted by a player who does not follow the tacit rules of the seminar. Feynman does not rise aggressively. His expression is not one of defiance, but of genuine and simple curiosity, the same expression he would have when questioning the nature of a subatomic particle. It is the calm before the storm, the moment when pretension is about to collide with reality. The climax arrives not with a thunderclap, but with a whispered question, so simple that at first it seems almost naive. Feynman doesn't construct a counter-argument. He doesn't quote another philosopher. He doesn't use any complex terminology. He simply applies his weapon, the Feynman Technique, in the form of a single question. He looks at the philosopher and, with all the sincerity in the world, asks for an example. The exact form of the question has been lost to history, but its essence was this. With all due respect, could you give me a concrete, real-world example of a situation that illustrates the principle you just described? The impact is immediate and devastating. The question doesn't play the philosopher's game. It refuses to operate at the level of abstraction. It demands that the cloud of jargon land on the solid ground of human experience. It is a demand for translation, for connection. Feynman's question was a scalpel that cut through all the layers of artificial complexity to find what lay beneath. It was a live application of his method. If you understand it, teach it to a child. Or, in this case, teach it to a physicist. The result is a deafening silence, more eloquent than any speech. The philosopher, who navigated the murky waters of metaphysics with such confidence, is suddenly stranded. He stops, blinks, and an expression of genuine confusion crosses his face. The question is so fundamental, so basic, that he doesn't have a ready answer. He tries to answer, of course. He begins to rephrase his point, but uses the same jargon as before. trying to pull Feynman back into his abstract playing field. Feynman waits patiently. The philosopher attempts an analogy, but the analogy is equally abstract. The audience, which had previously marveled at the complexity, now senses the awkwardness in the air. They realize, perhaps for the first time, that they too cannot think of a concrete example. The speaker's authority was not destroyed by a superior argument, but simply dissolved under the light of a simple question. The house of cards collapsed, not because it was attacked, but because someone poked at its base and discovered there was nothing there. The lesson was brutal and public. Complexity without substance is merely an elaborate form of ignorance. This iconic moment offers us a universal lesson on intellectual honesty. Feynman had a principle that guided his entire scientific and personal life, a rule he considered the cornerstone of science. He described it as follows, and it is one of the most powerful ideas you will ever find. The context was the need for absolute integrity in science, an honesty that goes beyond not lying to others, but reaches the more difficult point of not lying to oneself. The first principle is that you must not deceive yourself, and you are the easiest person to deceive. What Feynman is telling us here is revolutionary. He is identifying the greatest trap of thought, our infinite capacity to convince ourselves that we understand something when we are only familiar with the words. The philosopher in the seminar was not necessarily a malicious charlatan. It is far more likely that he was the first victim of his own jargon. He had deceived himself, believing that fluency in a complex language was the same as knowledge. Feynman's question was not an attack, it was an act of forced honesty. How can we transform this lesson into an actionable tool for our own lives? The method is surprisingly simple and can be applied in almost any situation. The next time you're in a work meeting and someone uses a buzzword like disruptive synergy or leverage paradigm, don't just shake your head. Politely ask, "Can you give me a specific example of how this would work in our project?" When you read a news story about politics and an expert talks about multifactorial geopolitical implications, stop and ask yourself, what does this mean for people in their daily lives? The beauty of this approach is that it serves two purposes. At best, the person will provide a clear example that will illuminate the concept for everyone. At worst, and this happens frequently, the lack of a clear answer will reveal the lack of substance behind the words. Feynman knew that testability was key. He had another quote that perfectly captures this idea. No matter how beautiful your theory is, no matter how intelligent you are, if it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's wrong. His question at the seminar was exactly that, an experiment to test the theory. The lesson from that seminar goes far beyond academia. We live in a society saturated with jargon and deliberate complexity. Politicians use vague language to avoid commitment. Marketing sells us products with pseudoscientific benefits. Corporations issue reports full of euphemisms to hide poor results. This complexity is not accidental. It is a tool of power. It creates a hierarchy between those who understand and those who don't, and discourages us from asking the most basic questions. It keeps us passive, confused, and easier to control. What Feynman showed us is that challenging this complexity is a fundamental act of citizenship. Demanding clarity is demanding accountability. When we refuse to be intimidated by big words and demand concrete, testable examples, we are shifting the balance of power. We are refusing to be mere recipients of information and becoming active participants in our own understanding of the world. The pursuit of simplicity is not a sign of a simple mind, but of a mind that refuses to be deceived. Feynman's weapon, that simple and devastating question, doesn't belong to the past. It's yours. Ownership of this mental tool is transferred to you now, at this very moment. It is your right, and in a way, your responsibility to use it. You are authorized to be the person in the room who says, "Excuse me, I didn't understand. Could you explain it another way?" You are authorized to admit ignorance not as a weakness, but as the first step toward true knowledge. Feynman's legacy is not a set of equations, but an attitude, a stance of courageous skepticism and relentless curiosity. Adopt this stance. Demand clarity from your leaders, your teachers, your media, and most importantly, yourself. Don't settle for the comfort of familiarity. Fight for genuine understanding. Feynman expressed this relentless pursuit beautifully when speaking about the nature of science. I'd rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. Let that be your philosophy. Question the answers. Love the questions. Ultimately, the story of Feynman's confrontation with philosophy isn't about humiliating an individual, but about celebrating an idea, the beauty of truth stripped of embellishment. The world is full of people who want to sell us easy answers, complete ideologies, and systems of thought that promise to explain everything. But true knowledge is more humble and far more rewarding. It's the journey, not the destination. It's the pleasure of dismantling an idea, seeing how it works, and rebuilding it with your own hands. Richard Feynman's legacy is an invitation to this adventure. It's a reminder that the simplest questions are often the most profound. He taught us that the search for truth doesn't require a sophisticated vocabulary or a prestigious degree. It requires only relentless honesty and the courage to say, "I don't know," and then the determination to find out. The true destruction of myths isn't about demolishing, but about building something stronger and truer in its place, a genuine understanding of the universe and our place in it.